Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we will get started learning TypeScript. So let's dive right into it. I'm looking at the TypeScript homepage, and they say TypeScript is JavaScript with syntax for types. Syntax is how you write code, so that's the style of coding, and types are what type of data are we going to be working with in our code, and that's what it's talking about. So JavaScript by default doesn't have a structure for type. If you assign a variable number, then assign the same variable a string right after and boolean right after that, JavaScript will not complain because that's okay. That's allowed in JavaScript. However, in TypeScript, we can make it so that it will complain, so the types will always be consistent. On enterprise projects, we mostly use TypeScript. Every time I have come across a project that is written in JavaScript, on enterprise level, first thing would be that we recommend them to switch it over to TypeScript. It'll just make the developer experience better, and also it will make it easier for us to pass the information along to the next developer that may be taking on the project. So it just also serves as a documentation as you write your code, which is great. All right, so let's take a look at some code examples and see how TypeScript can help us out. I have my terminal open. If you don't, go ahead and open your terminal, and I'm already in my code folder. I'll do a mkdir and work with TypeScript Playground. In this case, I already worked with that before, I guess. Where did that? And create that folder. I'll cd into that folder and open that in VS Code using code space dot. Dot is a relative path. That means in my current directory, open the entire folder in VS Code. Code is the alias command for opening VS Code from command line. All right, so I'll press enter. There we go. It has opened the folder structure in my VS Code and there's nothing in it yet. If I return to my terminal, I'll just do npm init space -y, enter, and that should start a npm project for me. Let's go back to VS Code, and yes, it did start it for me. Package.json is there. Let's create a new file, call it index.js. Now, index.js means we're working with JavaScript still. If we were working with TypeScript, it would be called index.ts. That's the extension that you use to work with TypeScript. VS Code has built-in support for TypeScript. So I will write some code. I'll say there's a const a equals to number 5. Actually, let's make it let. And then a equals to 5. And then a equals to true. And these are all okay in JavaScript. Then also, if we were to have another item like const array equals to 1, 2, 3. So you can see that's an array of numbers. However, I can go in and say array.push and push a number. And then array.push and push true or false in this case. I can also specify true or false here, and that would all be acceptable by JavaScript. Then you have to do some extra coding to figure out what data type are you working with and what methods are available to you. It gets a little messy if you're working on bigger projects. So let's introduce TypeScript to our project. In order to do so, I'll rename my file from JS to TS. And you can see right away in the file, there's a few errors that are coming up. So let's take a look at one error at a time. First one is on line number 3. It's telling me that let a is a type of array. So VS Code automatically implied, or TypeScript basically automatically implied, that since you're assigning a to a number 5, I will assume that a would be a number type. That means if you assign it a string, then there would be a problem. Or if you assign it a boolean, there would be a problem with that too. So how do we fix that? Well, one way would be to make this a type of any. Whenever you want to assign a type to a variable, you have to put colon and then the type name. And there are many available to us. There's string, there's number, boolean, that's a true or false. There's any, which is any type goes, and ignore TypeScript here, which is fine too. Unknown, which means I don't know what this type would be, so just ignore it anyways. Any and unknown serve pretty much the same purpose, except that unknown would be something that you can come back to and type it later, whereas any just won't comment at all. Let's see what else is there. Never, we don't really use that often. There's undefined. Undefined will create a problem because that means this letter A or the variable A cannot be assigned to any value. That's what undefined would mean. Or null value, almost the same thing. It's just that it's initialized, but it doesn't have a value. It's an opposite of a value, which is null. But in this case, I'll say number. Now, remember, I didn't have to specify number. TypeScript automatically assumed that variable a would be a number, but I wanted to put that down anyways. That's just the style of coding that we would work with. This is called explicit typing rather than implicit, where TypeScript will imply this is a number type, where I would explicitly say it is a number type. You don't have to imply it. All right, so let's fix our errors. I think I don't need to assign string anymore, so I'll take that away and take that away as well. That fixes those errors for me. Very simple, of course, because in this case, we're just working with sample. Next, let's take a look at array. Now, array is not complaining as much. It is complaining down here. It says argument of type number is not assignable to a parameter of type number or boolean. All right, so that's a problem. It's assuming, because I put a boolean here, it's assuming that this is an array of numbers and booleans, but that's not true. This is supposed to be an array of number. So if I take away boolean from here, notice that number 5 starts complaining too. So it's assuming that array is now a number array. That's how you specify number array in TypeScript. So this is implied. I'm going to explicitly say, yes, you're right. It is a number array. And all these errors that are occurring, delete those and fix those errors. All right, so that's how TypeScript works in a project. It just enhances your developer experience, especially when you're working with Fetch API to get information from backend server. By the time the data comes back, Fetch API may not know the structure of that data, so you can type it and then work with that on your code, which is very, very useful. All right, so we looked at some primitive types. Let's take a look at some other types like object and array. We already looked at one where you can just provide a primitive type and say array, and that would consider that data type into an array. We can do the same thing with, let's call it number array. str array will be a string array. And if I like to work with that, if I try to do 1 and 2, it's not going to work. But if I say 1 is a string, 2 is a string, that works just fine. Then we have the boolean array, bool array, boolean type, and I can say true, false, true, true again, so on and so forth. So you can see how array types work. Let's take a look at how object type works. So if I do a const user and assign that object a name key with a value of John, capital J, and age key with a value of number 19, and is active key with a value of boolean true. And let's see how it looks. If I was to hover over user, VS Code will give me the type for this constant. In this case, it gets everything correctly. It was telling me the name, it will be a string, age will be a number, and is active would be boolean, which is great. Now, what happens if I was to create many users using an array of objects? So let me show you what I mean. Start an array, assign that to a const of users, and we have one user so far, but let's create another one. Let's style this better. Code is looking a little messy already. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's copy over all the keys from here, and instead of John, instead of age being number, let's provide it now a string. Save that, and if I hover over users, you can see that there's 2 types available to us, and the type is looking very messy. And the reason for that is because we have 2 different kind of objects in this array. So as I keep adding more and more objects, and each object may be slightly different, it will assume that each object is unique, so each object has different type, which is not great. I want my users to be very specific and linearly aligned. So in order to do that, I will work with something called interface. Interface in TypeScript is an object type, and that just allows you to write object key values implicitly or explicitly. So I'll say interface, and usually when you write interfaces, convention of coding would say that you should name them starting with I, capital I. You could name it just user and that would work. However, best to just work with I user and then curly braces now we have started writing an interface. And in this interface, there will be a key of name, which will be a string value, age of number value, and isActive of boolean value. And now I will take this iUser and assign users object or array object with iUser array. So this is now we're using interface type as an array rather than primitive types such as we did on line number 3, 4, and 5 with number or string or boolean array. Now we're working with array of object. And notice that on line number 21, I'm getting a problem where it's telling me that age cannot be a type of string, which is great. Now, as a coder, I know I made a mistake here. Let's fix that up. Let's take a look at types next. Type keyword in TypeScript is like assigning a constant in JavaScript. So I can say type user ID equals to string, and that's a type. Usually you would use them to create aliases like I did right now. Actually, the user ID that would be assigned to every user, if I was to bring this up, let me delete that from here, bring it up to line number 7. And in my iUser interface, I'll say every user will have an ID, and this ID will be a type of user ID. Notice that in line 15, I have problems with my objects, and if I hover over that, it will tell me you're missing the ID prop, and the ID prop will be a string value. And so I'll do that. I'll say ID1, ID2, and that fixes the problem. So what we have done here is on line number 7, we have started using alias, which is just a name that will mean something to a human rather than a computer. And we're saying a string value will be assigned to user ID, and then user ID will be required for every object in that array. Let's work with some optional types in iUser. In iUser right now, all the things are mandatory. You need an ID, you need a name, you need an age, and you have to have isActive feature turned true or false. In some cases, I may not need isActive. If the isActive is missing, I'll just assume that they're not active. So I don't really need it. So let's say in this case, line number 26, I'll delete isActive, and you would notice that it would start complaining, and it would say that isActive is missing, which is fine. Now let's make isActive nullable. So that's done by question mark before the colon. That means this is optional. Some objects may have it, some objects may not have it. When they have it, it will be named, it will be a type of boolean. If they don't have it, it will be type of undefined. So that's one way to do it. If you do want to be more explicit about this, you can say it can be type of undefined. Question mark just a shorthand to do that. I would prefer that over undefined, like so. And notice that when I did the undefined, I used a pipe character to do undefined. Pipe character just says either or. So it can be a type of number or it can be a type of undefined. So you can say this age can be type of number or can be type of string, can be type of boolean. It's almost like saying any, but more explicitly. So you can tag on types one after another. So this is either or. Great. Let's start working with functions typed in TypeScript. Let's see how that looks. So I'll scroll down and start a new function with the function keyword, create user, that would expect a name, age, and isActive arguments, and it will return an object with the same name that you passed it, age, and isActive. Perfect. And if I call this create user function with some values, John 19 and true, everything works just fine. No complaints by TypeScript. That means there is some implying happening here. So let's see what that looks like. I'll also assign this to a new user. Great. So first things first, let's hover over create user, and we can see that VS Code tells me this is a function. There's a function called create user. It expects a name of type any. So it wasn't really able to identify a name is going to be a string. Age is any as well. isActive is any as well. So it didn't really imply anything there. It just anything is possible. You can pass it anything and it will just work. And it will return you a name of any as well, age of any as well, and isActive as well. So it didn't really imply too much, except that it just knows that it's a function, takes in 3 arguments, and returns an object with 3 keys, but those types could be anything. So let's explicitly specify what the function expects and what it returns. In order to do that, for name, we will use a colon right after and type string. For age, colon, we'll do number. Is active, colon, we'll do boolean. So that's typing our arguments. Let me just move them to new line so they're easy to view. Perfect. And next thing would be is what is this returning? Create user is returning something. So if I hover over my types for name, age, is active is fine. But for return, I still don't have a proper return. It's not returning a ID that I may want to return. So in this case, I'll just say on line number 34, ID will always be a string value of some sort and pass it number 1. And in a return, so after the function parentheses, before the curlies, before you get into the function, I can pass a colon and return I user interface that I created earlier to say this create user will return you the same type that I have in the array. And if I hover over that, you can see that it says I user will be returned to you. So if I was to go now and say users.push new user, this would work. If I hadn't specified that, it would still work. Reason for that is because the types match. But if I didn't have ID, it would complain because now my types don't match. So if I had already provided it that return type would always be IUser, then I would have caught this problem earlier in the function implementation to say, oh, this is returning an ID. This is supposed to have an ID of type string. So I should pass that back. All right, perfect. So that's what TypeScript does for us. It's not very different from JavaScript. It just makes it so that every JavaScript type is specified. It makes it an easier developer experience. All right, I'll see you all in the next video.